So thanks very much for inviting me to come and speak with you about my book. This is the first in-person presentation I've done on this book. So my PowerPoint skills might be a little rusty. And if one of you would scream out, "You're on mute!" at some point during the presentation, I'd feel a lot more comfortable. So when you publish a book entitled The Most Hated Man in Kentucky, everybody likes to guess who it is. So several people guessed some of our current politicians, but the particular politician depended on the partisan leaning of the person I was speaking with. A lot of people actually guessed former Duke University basketball player Christian Laettner. And I appreciate you all laughing at that, because I did use that joke at another gathering, and nobody got it. And I don't know whether that's from the passage of time or lack of interest in sports, but I appreciate you all laughing at that. But no one guessed Stephen Burbridge. And I guess that there's a picture of Stephen. That stands to reason somewhat, because after decades of being despised, he's kind of sunk into relative obscurity, known mostly to historians and people who are interested in Kentucky Civil War history. But if you had been alive in Kentucky during the last decades of the 19th century, there is little doubt that Burbridge would hold the title of Most Hated Man. To give you a flavor of how Kentuckians thought about him, let me just give you a small sample of commentary on Burbridge from newspapers and from politicians dating from the mid-1860s into the 1880s. A paupered, lecherous, despised, and criminal outcast who will forever be denied rest in the hereafter. An imbecile with a weak intellect and an overwhelming vanity. That's the governor talking. Various newspapers called him a blood-stained tyrant, another a demon in human shape. One editorialist was disappointed that a friend of his was a Christian because the friend had failed to gun down Burbridge in the streets of Washington, D.C. when their paths had crossed. So he was not well liked. And I assume many of you are probably passingly familiar with Burbridge and his reign as military commander of the District of Kentucky, which lasted from March 1864 to February 1865. During that time, he banned certain books and periodicals. He interfered in Kentucky's elections and its economy. He arrested and banished dissenters, and he executed prisoners in retaliation for acts that they had not committed. For these and other reasons, most white Kentuckians loathed him. And on its face, you could say they were justified in that hatred. We don't tend to favor clampdowns on civil liberties. We don't like election interference by the military. We don't like summary executions, for the most part. But the title of this talk is Reconsidering Stephen Burbridge. So what I want to do is let's see if he was as big a bastard as everybody said he was. And let's look closely at the context in which his actions were taken, and let's question the motives of some of those who were so eager to fan the flames of hatred against him. And that's what I've tried to do in the book, and what I'll try to do a little bit of in this talk. So let me give you a little bit of background on Burbridge. This is just a little baby family tree that I did up on the PowerPoint, so it just goes back a single generation to his father. So he was the son of bluegrass elites. Robert Burbridge was his dad, married Eliza Barnes, who was the daughter of a Mississippi plantation owner. And at one point, Robert Burbridge was the wealthiest man in Scott County. Burbridge was the youngest son and was born and raised in Scott County. In the 1850s, he moved to Logan County, relocated there with his brother. When the war started, he recruited the 26th Kentucky Infantry Regiment very early in the war, soon after the initial call for troops. Moved quickly up through the ranks, made brigadier general by June of 1862, and participated in the Vicksburg campaign. In general, he seemed to have been a fairly competent commander who earned the respect of his soldiers and praise from his commanding officers. He was officially named commander of the Military District of Kentucky on March 25th, 1864. So that date is important if you want to put Burbridge's actions into context, because in March 1864, Kentucky was a mess. It was formerly a Union state, but it was far from the front lines, but it nevertheless had a sizable number of Confederate sympathizers among its white population. It was subject to an increasing number of raids from Confederate cavalry and from guerrilla attacks. And support for the Union cause was wavering amongst the Unionist population of Kentucky, but more importantly, among influential Unionist elites who held power in the state. So this was the situation in which Burbridge took command. So first off, I want to talk about this conflict among Kentucky's Unionists. Now, in our day, I think there is a tendency to associate the Union with abolition and with anti-slavery. But as most of you here are probably aware, many of Kentucky's Unionists were pro-Union and pro-slavery. In fact, they were pro-Union because they were pro-slavery. They had argued against secession in 1861 because they felt that the best way to preserve slavery in Kentucky was to stay in the Union. After all, the federal government had protected and preserved slavery through law and policy up until 1860, and they expected that if they seceded, they would lose that protection and probably lose slavery. So they won that argument in 1861. Kentucky stayed in the Union, and most Unionist slaveholders expected that the federal government would not endanger their slave property. In 1863, though, the Emancipation Proclamation caused them to question that expectation. But the proclamation did not really touch Kentucky directly, and the provision that allowed enslaved people to enlist in the Union Army did not apply in Kentucky. By early 1864, Kentucky was unique among Union states in that its black population could not enroll or enlist for military service. As a result, thousands of black Kentuckians left the state to enlist in neighboring states, and if they had been enslaved in Kentucky and made that journey, they were free once they enlisted. Kentucky's situation then changed in February 1864, just as Burbridge was assuming command. Congress amended the Enrollment Act and ended Kentucky's exemption from black enlistment and enrollment. Soon after that, Kentucky failed to meet its quota of troops from its white volunteers and from white draftees, and as a result, Burbridge issued Order Number 34 in April of 1864. And that order instructed provost marshals in each district to, quote, receive and regularly enlist as soldiers all able-bodied Negro slaves and free colored persons of lawful age who wanted to serve. Order number 34, if you read it, is hemmed in by certain restrictions, by some ambiguous language, but those restrictions and ambiguities are blown apart by the reaction of African Americans to that offer. They flocked to recruiting centers and they blew apart any kind of narrowness that Order number 34 tried to put around black recruitment. So there was a tremendous negative reaction to all this among Kentucky's white Unionists. A pronounced division developed between so-called conservative Unionists or pro-slavery Unionists and unconditional Unionists. Conservative Unionists wanted no change in the initial bargain under which they had entered the conflict. They supported the Union. They supported the defeat of the Southern Rebellion. They did not support emancipation or any interference with the institution of slavery. The Union as it was and the Constitution as it is was their rallying cry. Unconditional Unionists, on the other hand, were willing to follow federal wartime policy wherever it might lead. So if the defeat of the Confederacy required an assault on slave owning, so be it. Preservation of the Union and restoration of the nation took precedence over commitment to maintaining slavery. So Burbridge was on the side of the unconditional Unionists, but he had not started the war committed to emancipation. Far from it, in fact. Early in the war, he had been criticized by more abolitionist-minded soldiers from northern states because he would return escaping slaves who came across his lines into his camps. He would return those slaves to their owners, who were largely Unionist owners. When the policy changed towards emancipation, as commander of Kentucky, he was willing, as previous commanders had not been, to endanger slavery for the sake of the Union cause. And so when he was charged with implementing the enrollment and enlistment of Kentucky's slaves, he issued Order Number 34. And he didn't just issue the order. He followed through on the promise of the order. He threatened punishment of those who tried to prevent blacks from signing up. He used black troops in the field for garrison duty. And most galling of all to white Kentuckians and farm owners, he used them for recruitment, sending recruitment squads onto the farms to recruit the slave owners' people. He put the abolitionist-minded James Brisbane in charge of black recruitment and the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, which was raised in Kentucky. And he cracked down on conservative Unionists who publicly complained about these policies. One of the most prominent of these conservative Unionists was Frank Wolford. Now, many of you may know Wolford's story. He is a genuine Union war hero. He was wounded 7 times. He fought in over 300 skirmishes. He was the dogged pursuer of John Hunt Morgan. So much so that when Morgan was brought to bay in Ohio after his 1863 raid, he sought out Wolford to offer his surrender. But Wolford could not countenance the idea of black troops. He denounced Lincoln as a tyrant. He called the enrollment of African Americans a violation of Kentuckians' guaranteed rights. And he said any federal enrolling officer should be arrested under Kentucky's slavery statutes, and offered his own men, his own troops, to back up the authority of the state in making those arrests. Governor Thomas Bramlett, who was on the stage with Wolford at the time he made those threats during a speech, and who was another Union veteran, and was someone who had actually supported Burbridge to be appointed as commander, was presumed to be on Wolford's side because he did not get up and protest, did not say anything different as Wolford made that speech. Bramlett himself considered issuing a call to Kentuckians to sue recruiters, federal recruiters, and pursue criminal proceedings in the state courts against those federal enrollment officers, promising to bring the whole power of the Commonwealth down on these officers. He was talked down from this position by Burbridge and by others during an all-night meeting in March of 1864. But he continually complained about black enlistment and about the way it was carried out, declaring at one point, "Truly loyal men are not willing that the status of the Negro shall be made a condition of the restoration of the government." So Bramlett's statement there kind of inadvertently gets to the nub of the problem in 1864. What did truly loyal mean in Kentucky in 1864? For Wolford and Bramlett and many others, it meant a commitment to ending the Southern Rebellion. Full stop. Bring the Southern states back into the Union, but respect their existing property rights, including the right to own other people. Loyalty meant, in other words, a commitment to the Union as it was. Unconditional Unionists viewed this as insufficient. The meaning of loyalty, they argued, had changed by 1864 because the nature of the war had changed. Restoration of the Union and ending slavery had both become objectives of the war, linked together. They were bedrock aims, and loyalty meant a commitment to both those aims. So in Kentucky, as a result, acceptance of black enlistment becomes a kind of shorthand for loyalty to the Union. In one of the loyalty oaths required of military contractors in Kentucky, for example, the stipulations were not only that you had not given aid or comfort to the Confederacy, but also that you would faithfully support the acts of Congress and proclamations of the President having reference to slaves. It's another example of a loyalty oath. It's a little different. It asks two questions. If you look at that second question, I don't know if you all in the back can see it. It says, will you faithfully sustain all the measures of the United States government to suppress the rebellion, including the enlistment of slaves in the U.S. Army? So clearly, the slavery issue had become a loyalty test, part of loyalty. Wolford, who was dishonorably discharged, arrested 4 times, and dressed down personally by Lincoln, was once offered a deal, a plea bargain, if you will, in which all the charges against him would be dropped if he pledged not to do or say anything that would hinder the employment and use of colored persons as soldiers. And Wolford refused the deal. So conservative Unionists loudly and regularly proclaimed their loyalty to the Union and claimed they were merely exercising their First Amendment rights to speak freely and criticize the government. They denounced Lincoln, they rejected the idea of black troops, and criticized emancipation as a war aim. Many of them, as you might expect, campaigned for George McClellan in the November 1864 presidential election. Now, to Burbridge and his military superiors, and to Kentucky's unconditional Unionists, these actions looked an awful lot like disloyalty. Specifically, Wolford and his ilk were discouraging enlistments, sapping morale, emboldening rebels and guerrillas by persuading them there was more support for the cause in Kentucky than there actually was, and thereby prolonging the war. Discouraging enlistments was illegal under federal law, and the state had a similar law on its own books. Under Kentucky's Disloyal and Treasonable Practices Act, it was illegal to speak or write against the government of the United States in a way that excited insurrection or rebellion. And to the eyes of the unconditional Unionists, that's exactly what Wolford and the other people were doing. They were exciting or further exciting insurrection or rebellion. One of Burbridge's beefs with Governor Bramlett, in fact, is that he doesn't seem to be interested in enforcing the law about disloyalty and treason. And so as military commander of Kentucky, Burbridge felt it was his job to do so. And so he instructed his officers to arrest those who publicly opposed black enlistment and denounced emancipation. He threw some of them in jail. He banished others beyond the Confederate lines. For many of them, he demanded peace bonds from others. Peace bonds pledge your money and shut up. And if you speak, we'll take the money. He also barred certain people from running for office because of what he viewed as their public stances against Lincoln's policies. And he wanted cooperative local officials in place to help with the enrollment, make sure that the right people were on the lists, and to keep tabs on Confederate sympathy in their district. So he interfered in elections to get the people in office that would cooperate with his administration. He was not always successful, but he did interfere. Now, Burbridge's critics charge that many of these arrests, especially of the more prominent conservative figures, were done for partisan purposes to help Lincoln win re-election. And it is clear that there were some partisan motivations at play, particularly in the timing of some of the arrests and the timing of the releases of some of the detainees. But as even Lincoln said, he would have heard of a lot more arrests in Kentucky if you could be arrested just for opposing his re-election. Because as many of you probably know, McClellan won Kentucky. And Burbridge then continued to make arrests after the election was over. So it couldn't have been just partisanship that was motivating him. And he made arrests for speeches that he deemed treasonable. And these arrests after the election were over finally persuaded or led Bramlett to petition Lincoln personally to remove Burbridge from command. So historians have long criticized Burbridge for this clampdown on political expression and civil liberties. And they have lamented his lack of tact and forbearance. And they have suggested that these harsh policies were to blame for white Kentuckians' alienation from the Union cause. And they have argued that a smoother man at the top, administering the state with a gentler hand, would have had greater success. But this is why I think examining the context of these policies is so important. Because Unionist disenchantment with the war was not the result of Burbridge's policies. Rather, Burbridge's policies was the result of Unionist disenchantment, specifically disenchantment with the turn towards emancipation. It is hard to see what policies Burbridge's could have followed that would have brought conservative Unionists back into the fold, short of taking emancipation off the table, which was what they wanted, but which was not really an option. He was the commander of the state, ordered to control the expression of disloyal sentiments within his jurisdiction. He did his duty, and then he has been well hated by Kentuckians for it ever since. So I've not yet talked about the executions that were ordered by Burbridge. And I argue in the book that the critics of the executions need to be analytically separated from the critics of the crackdown on civil liberties. The latter were largely fellow Unionists who complained about Burbridge's policies as they were happening. These people, the people who were arrested and their friends and allies, disparaged Burbridge for his interference with free expression and for his interference in state politics, but they mostly gave him a pass on the executions. After all, thousands of men were still dying on battlefields across the South, so a few dozen guerrillas executed was not a major issue for them. The critics of the executions were mostly returned Confederates and Confederate sympathizers who vilified Burbridge after the war was over. And they weren't silent about the civil liberties issues, but they consistently attacked Butcher Burbridge. It was they who gave him that nickname, and condemned the executions as military murders for generations after the war was over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the executions and the reasons behind them and Burbridge's logic, and then I'm going to get to the reaction to those executions. So Burbridge's problem was one that faced other Union commanders in other parts of the war and commanders in other wars waged by the United States. How do you fight an insurgency? Guerrillas attacked Unionist civilians, federal troops, and government infrastructure. They joined Confederate cavalry raids, and afterwards they slipped back into the civilian ranks, aided by numerous sympathizers within the larger white population. And during Burbridge's tenure, the number of attacks ticked up steadily during 1864, especially after Burbridge's defeat of John Hunt Morgan at Cynthiana in June. As Morgan's force disintegrated, some of his men followed him back to Virginia. But a significant proportion stayed in Kentucky to fight on a kind of freelance basis, to raise havoc on what they called detached duty. And that is a reason why the attacks go up steadily during 1864. At the same time, federal troops are being stripped out of Kentucky by Burbridge's commanding officers to go fight at the front lines. So without sufficient troops to garrison and protect every vulnerable site in the state, and with a very deep distrust between the federal officers and troops and the state militia over the loyalty of the state militia, Burbridge relied on a strategy initially that was basically hearing about a guerrilla attack and then sending out troops to chase the guerrillas and try and catch them. Or he would concentrate his troops, pull soldiers from various posts, concentrate his troops, and just concentrate on the biggest threat. When he would ask for more troops to be sent to Kentucky, and he would be told, concentrate your forces and focus on the biggest threat. And that's what he did. So the guerrillas almost always had the initiative, and they almost always had the upper hand in the struggle. So in July, he settles on a new strategy. He issues Order Number 59. Now, if you couldn't read the loyalty oath, you really can't read that. But the important part is in the last sentence. Whenever an unarmed Union citizen is murdered, 4 guerrillas will be selected from the prisoners in the hands of the military authorities and publicly shot to death in the most convenient place near the scene of outrage. Over 60 people were killed through the workings of Order Number 59. Those killed were not responsible for the attack that ended in the civilian's death. They had been apprehended for other reasons. for being a Confederate soldier behind the lines and away from his unit, for belonging to a guerrilla band that Federal troops had captured, for threatening or attacking Unionist civilians independently, some because a Unionist neighbor had said, "That guy's a guerrilla." At some point, they had been picked up by Federal soldiers. They had been given some sort of cursory investigation and then forwarded to Louisville or Lexington or some other military prison to be held. Now, Burbridge never laid out his thinking behind Order Number 59, but I think we can kind of discern the logic behind it. He thought that guerrillas would refrain from attacks if they knew that the result would be the death of their comrades. Of course, the problem with that logic is that not all guerrillas are comrades. Some leaders of the irregulars operating in Kentucky made overtures to save their own men, but they didn't really care about the other men in federal custody. Guerrillas did not operate in a coordinated way or share tactics and strategies, and so the idea that public executions of other people would deter them was wrong. So if you judge Order 59 just by the effectiveness, it is a failure. Guerrilla attacks are not curtailed by these executions. But Burbridge's post-war critics don't attack Order Number 59 solely on the effectiveness. They point out that it wasn't effective. But their real complaint is that the executions are cruel and arbitrary violations of the laws of civilized warfare. In the words of Basil Duke, who was Morgan's second in command and who, through his writings, was instrumental in fashioning a pro-Confederate lost cause view of the war in Kentucky, Burbridge was an insensate bloodhound who shot all the prisoners he could lay his hands on. So I'm going to focus on just two of the main issues that Burbridge's critics pointed out. The first is the lack of due process for those who were executed. Burbridge maintained until the end of his days that the men who were executed had been subject to trial before a military commission. Now, proceedings before military commissions were supposed to be quite formal. There was supposed to be a formal impaneling of the officers on the commission. The proceedings were supposed to be written down. The decisions were supposed to be approved by the commander, and then the records were supposed to be forwarded to Washington for review and final approval by the Judge Advocate General. It is safe to say that most of the time, for the men held by Burbridge as guerrillas, none of that happened. And when he was challenged to produce the records of the proceedings, he could not. And no scholar that I'm aware of, including myself, has located, with a couple of notable exceptions, there are a couple of proceedings, any of these formal records in the archives. What we have instead are hints of more casual proceedings, convened on the spot by local commanders, or of very limited investigations conducted by the soldiers who apprehended the prisoner. We also have newspaper accounts of prisoners being transferred from one prison to another, ostensibly for purposes of trial before a military commission. But without records of the proceedings, it's difficult to know what happened and if those happened in accordance with the rules that were supposed to be followed. So the critics have a point. But I think we have to look again at the context of this criticism. The emphasis on due process, I think, borrows a concept from civilian law and imports it into military law. Those executed aren't being punished for a particular action for which they're being adjudged guilty. That is not what Order 59 is about. Those executions were meant to deter future actions by other guerrillas by retaliating for past actions against prisoners already in federal hands. So Order Number 59 never claimed that the men who were shot were killed because they were being held accountable for their own private actions. Unable to lay hands on those who were responsible, Burbridge basically was trying to send a very bloody and very grisly message to the other guerrillas in the field: stop doing this. This concept of retaliation was valid under the laws of war as they were understood at the time, and in fact, retaliation is an accepted part of the laws of war even to this day. It allows an offended party who has been subject to an attack by an enemy that itself violates the laws of war to retaliate against enemy combatants in their hands as a way to deter further illegal attacks. So in other words, it allows a violation of the laws of war by Party A to retaliate for a violation of the laws of war by Party B. In the Union understanding of things, the guerrilla attacks were illegal and violations of the laws of war, and therefore retaliation was justified. So this brings us to the second point that Burbridge's critics like to hammer home. They insisted that the men who were executed were legitimate Confederate soldiers engaged in legitimate military actions. Not outlaws, not guerrillas. This was just a convenient label to hide behind in order to carry out illegitimate violence against defenseless men who found themselves in federal hands and should have been treated as prisoners of war. But again, the legal context is important here. In response to his time fighting guerrillas in Missouri, the Union General Henry Halleck asked the Columbia University legal scholar Francis Lieber to examine the status of guerrilla warfare under international law. And Lieber ended up producing an entire reformulation of the laws of war, the so-called Lieber Code, which was issued in April 1863, and that became the basis for Union actions in the war and for Burbridge's actions in Kentucky. Now, the Lieber Code actually lays out a fairly detailed set of requirements for combatants to be considered legitimate soldiers and thus subject to treatment as prisoners of war. The fighters had to be uniformed, under a chain of command, with orders specifying some military objective and with the manpower necessary to accomplish that objective. It categorized those who did not meet these requirements under a variety of titles like armed prowler, squads of men without commission, war rebels, but clarified that these men were liable to trial by military commission and imprisonment and execution. Now, Adam Johnson, who was a leader of irregular forces in western Kentucky, complained about this. He complained at being branded by the Lincolnites as guerrillas. And he insisted that he and his men were regular soldiers in the Confederate Army. But when he put this to the test, when he went to Louisville and made an offer of parley with the Union commander in Louisville, he wanted to discuss Order 59 and how it would be applied. The Union commander in Louisville, who was appointed by Burbridge, told him, no, you are a small force composed of irresponsible men distant from Confederate lines. You have no legitimate purpose, and you are not a legitimate combatant. Now, it is true that among the list of men executed under Order 59, there are several who claimed membership in various Confederate military units. And for Burbridge's detractors, this meant that all of them were legitimate combatants and should have been treated as POWs. It did not matter to his critics that they had been picked up behind Union lines. It did not matter they had not been with their unit when they were apprehended. It didn't matter that they were not wearing a Confederate uniform when they were taken. In the eyes of his critics, anyone who had enlisted in the Confederate Army at any time, at any place, was deemed to be a legitimate Confederate soldier for all time. But this was not how Burbridge or how Burbridge's superior officers saw these people. In the Union's understanding, the attacks carried out by small groups of armed men not under the Confederate chain of command were violations of the laws of war, and the participants in those attacks, even if they were enlisted soldiers, were subject to apprehension and retaliation, including execution. As an officer in the Union Army and commander of Kentucky, Burbridge had a duty to enforce the law as it was understood by the Union. Charged with controlling the attacks of guerrillas and irregular forces in Kentucky, he undertook measures that were undeniably harsh, but the measures that were within the bounds of the law and the bounds of precedent as these were understood by Union officers. Because if you can look at other parts of the South and other parts of the border regions of Missouri and West Virginia, and you can see Union commanders kind of pulling from some of that same toolbox when they were confronted with guerrilla attacks. Like Burbridge, they used collective community punishments when the guerrillas could not be apprehended, and they resorted to summary executions. So, I said at the beginning that this talk calls for a reconsideration of Burbridge. And in much greater detail in the book, I have tried to prompt that reconsideration by looking closely at the context in which the clampdown on civil liberties and the execution took place. But it is also pertinent to consider those, or reconsider those, who cultivated the hatred of Burbridge and who attached the epithets of tyrant and butcher to him. Those were largely returned Confederates supporting a lost cause view of the war and their allies among disaffected Kentucky Unionists. Now, historians have studied for a long time Kentuckians' embrace of the lost cause. And you know this, but just to summarize, the lost cause view of the war extols the gallantry of the Southern soldier. It criticizes the brutality of the Northern armies. It celebrates the patriotic motivations behind the Southern struggle for independence, and it laments the misguided objective of freeing the enslaved people of the South. This view became dominant in Kentucky after the war. And here, I think I'm almost obligated to quote E. Merton Coulter and his famous aphorism from 1926, "Kentucky waited until the war was over to secede from the Union." And what Coulter described has since been studied by more recent historians who look at the way public memory of major events is constructed. And what they focus on is the cultural work that this requires. These historians argue that the way we remember our shared history, it doesn't just happen kind of naturally. It takes effort, it takes work. And when an event is remembered in a particular way, it means that other ways of remembering that event have been pushed to the margins. What I would argue is that a significant part of the effort to enshrine a lost cause view of the war in Kentucky involved blackening the name and reputation of Burbridge. Hatred of Burbridge, in other words, is part of the pro-Confederate cultural memory project that begins shortly after the war. So in addition to the normal stuff of Confederate memory that you find in Kentucky, statues to the Confederate dead, the celebration of Confederate leaders with ties to Kentucky like Morgan and Jefferson Davis, the regimental reunions and picnics, and the formation of local branches of Confederate heritage organizations, there are Burbridge-specific commemorations as well. Martyrs' monuments are erected in various locales to commemorate those who had been executed under Order Number 59. There were reinterments of some of the victims of the executions, with processions and speeches by local notables and days of mourning to mark these reburials. And stories of Burbridge's misdeeds were consistently rehashed in the press and in local histories. All of this was meant, to quote the United Daughters of the Confederacy, to keep fresh the memory of Burbridge's infamy in the minds of white Kentuckians. And by keeping fresh the memory, it reminded them of the oppressions they had suffered at the hands of the Union Army, and it linked those oppressions to the much vaster suffering of the defeated South, and it energized the political criticism of the post-war Republican Party and the policies of Reconstruction. So let me give just a single example of this Burbridge strategy that I find particularly interesting. In 1866, there was an election for the clerk of the Court of Appeals, which is a fairly minor office. It pitted Edward Hobson against, Hobson was a former Union general who had served under Burbridge and was backed by the Republicans and by the Conservative Union Party. And it pitted him against Alvin Duval, a Democrat who had fled the state early in the war when he was threatened with arrest by Burbridge for disloyal sentiments. But if you read the coverage of the contest, of the election, you could be forgiven for not knowing who Duval's opponent was. Because in story after story, what mattered was what Burbridge had done to Duval and to Kentucky. "Thank God we have no Burbridge now to dictate to and rule over us," read an endorsement of Duval in the Louisville Courier. Another partisan wrote, the election will turn upon the relative merits of Burbridge and Duval. He warned voters that in the great case of Burbridge versus Duval, it will look very badly to see your name on the Burbridge side of the ledger. The sins of Burbridge, and thus by extension Hobson, were then also tied to the post-war sins of the Republican Party. Summarizing the crackdown on civil liberties and the executions under Burbridge, a Lexington paper wrote that the supporters of Hobson included every Burbridge man, every Freedmen's Bureau man, every Civil Rights Bill man, every man who is for the pending Negro Equality Amendment, by which was meant the 14th Amendment, and argued that Burbridge should actually be in jail and would be if it were not for the Satanic Party in Congress. This constant recycling of grievances against Burbridge's wartime policies, the smearing of his reputation and that of anyone closely associated with him, the linking of his wartime policies to the Republican Party and its post-war policies, all helped push white Kentuckian sympathies in a distinctly pro-Confederate direction. And it was very successful. The Democratic Party, led by ex-Confederates, came to control state government in the Commonwealth for the next several decades. Burbridge was eventually hounded from the state, and white Kentuckians firmly embraced the lost cause version of the Civil War. However, Kentucky may be moving on from the lost cause. Some Confederate monuments have come down, and current-day historians have been thoroughly challenging the rosy view of the Confederacy contained in earlier works of Kentucky history. So maybe it is time to move on from the general contempt for Burbridge as well. If we place his wartime actions in the proper context, we find that much of the hatred directed at him was a reflection of white Kentuckians' hatred for the end of slavery. His critics expected Burbridge to facilitate a debate over the legitimacy of the wartime policy of emancipation, and they were angered when he insisted that in fact there was no debate to be had. The wartime emergency demanded a certain standard of loyalty, and if it was not met, Burbridge was charged with enforcing the consequences. The executions, as repugnant as they are to modern sensibilities, were legal responses to an illegal insurgency convulsing the state. They were in line with policies pursued by Union commanders in other areas, and they were sanctioned and approved by Burbridge's commanding officers. The attempt to transform them into illegitimate military murders carried out by an aspiring dictator was largely a post-war ideological ploy by those eager to portray Union wartime measures and Republican post-war policies in the worst light possible. The long hatred of Burbridge is a measure of their ideological success. The current reinterpretation of that ideology may finally pull the black cloak off Burbridge himself and allow modern students of Kentucky's Civil War history to gain a new perspective on the most hated man in Kentucky. Thank you for paying attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I ran a little bit long, and I apologize for that.